Order. I have received a letter from the honourable member for Wentworth proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the government's refusal to subject the national broadband network to appropriate parliamentary and economic scrutiny, including an independent cost-benefit analysis. I call upon those members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places. The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The National Broadband Network is the largest investment of taxpayers' money in infrastructure in our nation's history. It has been subject to no financial scrutiny, and remarkably the government continues to refuse to submit it to a cost-benefit analysis. Now, in question time, the minister insulted the intelligence of this House and insulted the Australian people by pretending to suggest or attempting to suggest that Infrastructure Australia somehow or other endorsed his government's haphazard, reckless approach to the national broadband network. Now, in fact, the reverse is the case. In October last year, Infrastructure Australia published a paper on how to make better decisions for investing in infrastructure. And this is what they said. All initiatives proposed to Infrastructure Australia should include a thorough and detailed economic cost-benefit analysis. In order to demonstrate that the cost-benefit analysis is indeed robust, full transparency of the assumptions, parameters and values which are used in each analysis is required. And then Infrastructure Australia goes on to describe that in some considerable detail. Now, if this project is going to make the outstanding contribution to productivity, to our national economy that the government claims it will, then they have nothing to fear from submitting it to the Productivity Commission. There will be no delay in the construction of the test sites, no delay at all, no interruption at all. There will be, however, real accountability and real rigorous analysis of the kind the government has repeatedly said it's committed to, but in respect of this, the biggest infrastructure project in our history, it has refused to undertake. Now, there is so much that we do not know about this project. We don't know how much it will cost Australians to get access to voice or broadband services over it. We don't know what its costs or revenues will be. We don't know whether it will be commercially viable as a business. One broking firm suggested it would have a net present value of minus $9 billion. Let's hope that's overly gloomy, but it's not a very promising prognosis. We don't know whether it will ever achieve the heroic take-up rates that McKinsey assumed in its implementation study, rates without precedent anywhere else in the world. And we don't know what positive or negative economic or social spillovers the construction of the NBN will bring with it. The fact is, Mr Speaker, everybody in this House, I am sure, is committed to the availability of fast broadband at affordable prices across Australia. We all recognise that there are areas where that is not the case, in particular in regional and remote Australia. Only this week I met with two mayors from shires in the electorate of Maranoa, the shires of Barcoo and Diamantina. The NBN's not going to give them fast broadband. They've apparently been left out. And yet when you think of an appropriate destination for Commonwealth funds, for appropriate destination for Commonwealth investment in this area, surely those remote regions are the ones that should be prioritised, but they apparently are not going to be. Now, the Minister, Senator Conroy, has frankly acknowledged that he has no idea what applications typical households would use over the 100 megabit per second connection that is promising, a vastly greater amount of broadband connectivity than there is any use for at the household level today. Now, this is an important point, because if we are building at vast taxpayer expense, capacity for which there is not an application or a need, then what we are doing is making an enormous overinvestment. Because nobody argues that there is nowhere in Australia where there is adequate broadband. No one is saying that broadband is inadequate everywhere. The argument has always been that there are areas where it is inadequate, areas where it's not available. A more prudent approach would be to deal with those areas of underservice, and then as time progresses and if demand progresses and if other technologies are not overtaking fixed-line connectivity, then greater connectivity can be built. Build it and they will come is a recipe, a proven recipe, for losing billions of dollars, and in this case, losing it without any study, any analysis. Now, I note, Mr Speaker, that earlier this year, the Federal Communication Commission of the United States published a national broadband plan, and it targets as the minimum broadband speed that should be available across America speeds of at least 4 megabits per second, download speeds. Now, from our side of the House, we believe the target in Australia should be not less than 12 megabits per second. But in the United States, the home of the internet, they're talking about 4 megabits per second. Senator Conroy's talking about 100. Why are we so confident he is right and the Americans are wrong, as he keeps on contending? In that same report, which I commend to honourable members, at page 17, the FCC observes that speeds of less than 8 megabits per second are sufficient to deal with most uses, including two-way video conferencing. So again, where is the need, the applications that will consume 100 megabits per second to the household? Now, we've heard the Prime Minister give lectures, as recently as last night and again today in the House, about the perils of what she describes as economic Hansenism. And yet here we are with a government that is proposing to overthrow 20 years of telecommunications reform and 20 years of competition policy by creating a new government-owned monopoly over fixed-line communications in complete contravention of the existing competition laws. And so far in breach of the existing competition laws are these arrangements that will prevent any competition at the fixed-line basis with the NBN, that the government is proposing that the parliament pass a law to exempt the creation of this massive government-owned monopoly from the scrutiny of the ACCC. Now, the lack of scrutiny to this point of the NBN has been remarkable and, I'm afraid to say, unique anywhere in the world. The scale of this investment is without any precedent, not just in our own history. The United States is spending $7 billion of federal government money to support broadband initiatives. On a per capita basis, we are spending 100 times more. 100 times more. Why are we so confident that we are so right and the Americans, the home of the internet, are so wrong? Now, the government has claimed from time to time that the McKinsey KPMG implementation study, which Senator Conroy is proud to tell us repeatedly he paid $25 million for, really is all you need. And yet McKinsey at least had the candour to say that they were not asked to examine alternative options. They were not asked to examine the merits of the policy. It was given to them as a fait accompli, and they were simply asked to advise on its implementation. We know that Infrastructure Australia, the expert body that the Rudd government set up, has not been allowed to review the project, even though its whole mission is to identify, prioritise and rigorously assess infrastructure projects of national importance. And we know, until a couple of weeks ago, the NBN, embarking on a $43 billion project, had not even delivered a business plan to its board, much less to its shareholder, the Commonwealth Government. So for more money, substantially more money than it would cost to buy all of Telstra, this government is committed to building a new telecommunications monopoly from scratch before even receiving a business case from the management it is tasked to do so. Now, Mr Speaker, I remind the House again of what the Treasury Secretary Dr Ken Henry said last year. Government spending that does not pass an appropriately designed cost-benefit analysis necessarily detracts from Australia's well-being. Now, that lack of rigour and scrutiny in this project is why on Monday I introduced a private member's bill, the National Broadband Network Financial Transparency Bill 2010. It requires the publication of a 10-year business case for the NBN and, equally importantly, refers the NBN to the Productivity Commission for a thorough cost-benefit analysis. Now, there is so little known about this project. There has never been so much money spent with so little scrutiny. But what little we do know, the fragments of information we have, should give all of us great cause for concern. We know the take-up rates in Tasmania have been poor, even though the NBN company has entirely subsidised the wholesale cost of the line and is paying internet service providers $300 for every customer they sign up. They left early customers unaware of whether they would have to buy and install a battery backup to ensure their phone line would work during a power blackout. And it was only after pressure from the media did the NBN Co reveal it would provide a battery backup. Some customers in the early rollout sites have reported they've had to wait up to 3 months for the NBN to connect them to the network. And in Singapore, we learn the authorities have fined a partnership headed by Alcatel-Lucent $5 million Singapore dollars for failing to achieve on-time delivery of equipment to a broadband network in Singapore. In Australia, our NBN Co has also selected Alcatel-Lucent for its rollout and is apparently unable to confirm or deny whether similar delays are likely to be the case here. Now, when the government rejects calls for a proper cost-benefit analysis, it often points to a study done by Access Economics in March 2009 on the economy-wide impacts of a high-speed broadband network. Now, this study has very little relevance to the NBN. It is not a cost-benefit analysis. It was commissioned by Telstra in support of its proposal to build a 12 megabits per second fibre-to-the-node network to 90% of the Australian population, costing $12.64 billion over 11 years. It concluded there was a net benefit to GDP of $9.5 billion, as against a reference case which conservatively and unrealistically assumed, and I quote, technology and bandwidth would continue to increase, but at a noticeably greatly reduced rate than trends seen over the past few years. Well, we only have to look at what's happening in the wireless space to see that the increase in bandwidth is going at an accelerating pace. But it's worthy to reflect on this. If the GDP benefit, the net benefit, from a 12 megabits per second network costing $12.6 billion is $9.5 billion, how could there be a positive GDP benefit from a $43 billion fibre-to-the-home rollout to 93% of the population at 100 megabits per second unless there was a massive and proportionate increase in productivity by increasing the speed, the connectivity, from 12 to 100 megabits per second? This defies both common sense and experience. From a household point of view, there are few applications that will not run satisfactorily on 12 megabits per second. And plainly, there are diminishing returns from increasing levels of bandwidth. And that's reflected in the universal experience in the telecom sector that people will not pay a premium, if any, for an increase in bandwidth. So even if one were to accept this Access Economics report at face value, it should give us very, very serious cause to reflect, whether there is any prospect of there being a net benefit to our economy from this project. Everything we learn about this project gives us cause for concern. Everything we know about good government and prudence tells us a cost-benefit analysis is required. We have a minister who misled the House by suggesting Infrastructure Australia approved of this project and yet failed to draw to the House's attention you weren't in here.
The member for Wentworth will resume his seat. The Leader of Government of Business in the House.
Mr. Speaker, the member cannot say that.
What? No, the Leader of Government of Business in the House will resume his seat. Yeah. The Leader of Government of Business in the House will resume his seat. The member for Wentworth has a call. He didn't use the word deliberately. The member for Wentworth has the call for the last few seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the one thing that is absolutely clear is that Infrastructure Australia requires a rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and that is why this project will never go near Infrastructure Australia.
Order. The member for Wentworth's time has expired. I call the Leader of Government Business in the House.
I thank the member for his contribution. We're happy to debate the National Broadband Network and the importance of the National Broadband Network to our future economy, because this debate goes to the heart of which side of this House has a plan for our future economy, has a plan for building productivity, has a plan for the jobs of the future, has a plan for ensuring that regional Australia is able to participate fully in the economy, has a plan for the National Broadband Network which will do nothing less than transform our economy and the way that it functions. It will transform transport in terms of dealing with urban congestion. It will transform education and the way that education services are able to be delivered. It will transform health through the provision of e-health services. This is not just about downloads. This is about uploads. This is about what services can be provided. And it appears that those opposite, to be fair to the member for Wentworth, he is fulfilling his brief, because when he was appointed to the position by his opponent, the current Leader of the Opposition, said, "Who better to hold the government to account here than Malcolm Turnbull, who has the technical expertise and the business experience to entirely demolish the government on this issue." Those opposite are interested in demolishing the NBN. They're not interested in making a constructive contribution. And they put up, in order to do that, a number of myths. And today we've got the greatest myth of them all. They say that there has been no economic analysis. Well, Alan Kohler wrote of the member for Wentworth in the Business Spectator in September the following. Yesterday, he was repeating the ridiculous line that the government has undertaken $43 billion of expenditure without a detailed business plan or cost-benefit study, which has been the opposition's line throughout the campaign. But what do they call the $25 million, 546-page implementation study by McKinsey & Co and KPMG, released publicly on May the 6th? That study was a comprehensive study with a comprehensive financial analysis. It found there was a strong and viable business case for the NBN. It found that there was a sufficient rate of return to cover the cost of funds and positive returns to the taxpayer by year 6. It found that the cost estimate is conservative and can be reduced. The member opposite knows that in the next few weeks NBN's long-term business plan will be complete. He knows also that we will reach the halfway mark for the construction of regional backhaul links, the infrastructure that we need to roll out the information highway right across the country. He raises again Infrastructure Australia. Well, all I can do is point to the published and tabled in this document, in this parliament, the National Infrastructure Priorities, Infrastructure for an Economically, Socially and Environmentally Sustainable Future report of May 2009. The first document, comprehensive, produced by Infrastructure Australia under its chairman, Sir Rod Eddington. And what that says, when you go back to it, Australia's national infrastructure priorities, it goes through 7. There are 7. Number 1 is a national broadband network, developing a more extensive, globally competitive broadband system. And indeed, Infrastructure Australia recommended on page 13 of that report, and it was certainly taken up by the government, an investment from the Building Australia Fund to develop the national broadband network. They identified this as one of the 7 priorities because they understood what an enabler of future infrastructure it was. But it's not just them. It's not just them. To quote a member of this House, equally importantly, there would be continuing ferment of innovations, with multiple service providers able to deliver services over the new network. There will be new ideas emerging all the time, including many attractive choices which are not available today. A very insightful analysis from the Shadow Minister for Communications, the member for Bradfield, published in his book, a direct quote from his book, Wide Brown Land. A direct quote from the Shadow Minister. But they say also that Parliament hasn't had time to scrutinise this. Well, what do they think the Senate inquiry on NBN did all that time? It was extended 5 times and produced 5 reports. We've seen Senate committees on NBN-related bills, a discussion paper on regulatory reform, and we've debated this issue constantly in Parliament since prior to the 2007 election, when we went to the Australian people with a plan for national broadband, because we said that the 18 plans failed and abandoned one after the other by the coalition government simply weren't good enough. And the Australian people agreed with us, and they elected Labor to office, just as the independent members had the national broadband network very much front and centre when they determined to ensure that Julia Gillard was in a position to become Prime Minister after the August 21 election. This government is working hard to get the policy settings right for a competitive modern economy. We've introduced into the Parliament just last week the Competition and Consumer Safeguards Bill, again providing for structural separation, a job that should have happened when Telstra was privatised, but those opposite, in spite of the fact that some who are now opposite recognise that this is important, and I note the member for Wentworth seems to be hedging his bets and hopefully supporting this legislation. They'll be gradually crab-walking across to reality when it comes to the importance of structural separation. There will be an opportunity to do what should have been done many years ago. The fact is that the national broadband network is absolutely critical to our future productivity. ICT is the number one issue that can improve productivity for both service industry but also for the manufacturing sector. This NBN will support 25,000 jobs a year on average. It will provide great choice and lower prices for consumers because of the way that it is structured, providing a wholesale network and then allowing a multiplicity of retailers to build on the basis of that wholesale network. It will deliver health consultations and specialist advice in real time, such as our $392 million plan to give rural and regional Australia access to online specialist consultations. It will allow businesses in regional communities to effectively service their local and international customers. It is vital in terms of the delivery of smart infrastructure. And during the election campaign, I announced on behalf of the government at the Infrastructure Partnerships Australia conference in Melbourne that we would regard smart infrastructure as a necessary component of future infrastructure investment. Take urban congestion. Our investment in the Kwinana Freeway in Perth to install advanced technologies like variable speed limits and real-time lane management systems will optimise traffic flows, improve road safety and reduce emissions. This is vital. That's why the House of Reps Committee, I will refer to them, the previous reference that they had prior to the election to look at smart infrastructure under the chair of Sharon Bird, the member for Cunningham. Or take smart energy meters that give you an informed choice of energy source, price tariff, emissions intensity or just-in-time hot water heating. And of course, this technology will transform innovation. Associate Professor Robert Mullaney of UNSW recently said, if 90% of homes are connected to the NBN, it will cause a paradigm shift with new ideas and innovations, things we haven't even thought about yet. The fact is that those opposite had 19 failed plans when it comes to broadband. They said to wait for the ACCC advice. They said to wait for the implementation study. They said to wait for the government response to the implementation study. They filibustered the very bill on competition reform that would ensure a faster, cheaper and more efficient rollout of the NBN. 6 months since the implementation study was released, and the coalition simply haven't moved on. They haven't moved on beyond their policy of seeking to demolish the NBN. The fact is that those opposite are now refusing to even say, regardless of whatever any inquiry said, regardless of that, the member for Wentworth refuses to say whether he would back it in, regardless of whatever any study did which delayed the system. But of course, we know that they even from time to time deny that there's a problem. The member for Wentworth has said the NBN is an answer to a problem that has not even been identified. That is what he has said. The member for, and he repeats, what's the problem? What's the problem? The problem is, the member for Wentworth, we are ranked 50th for broadband speeds. There's not one city in the top 100 in the world for broadband speeds. I don't think that's good enough. Located where we are, in this region, where Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore and many of our competitors are rolling out fibre to the home, located in our region, where information technology is so important for competing, I don't think that's good enough. That's the problem. We are falling behind the region. Japan, New Zealand are rolling out fibre to the home. If it's good enough for New Zealand, it's good enough for us, I say. Only last week, the Broadband Quality Survey found Australia fell from 18th to 21st in the world broadband rankings. We are going backwards. At an enormous rate. And the fact is, it simply isn't good enough. Now, those opposite have rolled out a number of statements also about Tasmania. Well, here's what Stephen Love from Galloway's Pharmacy in Scottsdale has had to say. I've taken a 100 megabit speed offer that's actually very close to the cost of my previous ADSL2 Plus connection. The NBN will provide huge potential for lots of new applications, especially in health, which is of interest to me being a pharmacist. That's what they've had to say. And yet those opposite continue to be critical. The fact is, we know that in spite of the fact that there's an 11% take-up rate in 3 months, what did the implementation study say? The implementation study said that an annual take-up rate of between 6 and 12% was what was needed to be viable. And yet we have an 11% take-up rate in 3 months. Again, they know full well that one contract has to be finished with a provider before you go on to a new contract They know that full well, but they come in here and ask juvenile questions which could have come from the member for Bradfield when I was on the Sydney Uni SRC with him, when he was a supporter of Belinda Neal, and I was right then and I'm right today. But they used to come in. It is a student council type strategy to wreck the national broadband network. The fact is that this is a vital resource for Australia. And Ben Grubb has said this from the Sydney Morning Herald. Is the federal government duping us to get us onto its national broadband network by decommissioning Telstra's copper network? I think they are, and I think it is for their own good. Accept it. It's coming and it's a free connection. The replacement of the outdated copper network with the fibre to the home network, the communications technology for the 21st century, is something of which we are very proud.
I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on this matter of public importance. A debate very much about appropriate technology for the future, but a debate which is also about accountability, because the public have a right to know the taxpayers' funds are being used appropriately and responsibly, and this government is refusing the Australian people that fundamental right with regards to the national broadband network. The NBN is the largest taxpayer-funded investment in Australia's history. It is essential that the government provide taxpayers with complete transparency to ensure that they're getting value for money. Regrettably, we all know what happens when Labor tries to spend money. We've had the $2.4 billion waste through the pink bats disaster, a further $8 billion on the school hall rip-offs, a $1.2 billion blowout in the laptops for schools programs, and another $850 on solar homes. The amount of waste and mismanagement in Labor's first term is unprecedented in Australian history. In fact, it makes Whitlam seem like an amateur. The blowouts and mismanagement of taxpayers' money in Labor's first term demonstrates why the NBN needs proper scrutiny and why the project should be subject to rigorous parliamentary oversight. Instead of submitting to an independent cost-benefit analysis, the government is choosing instead to make wild claims about the kinds of services that faster broadband will offer. And as Kevin Morgan wrote today in The Australian, and I quote, "It's all starting to sound too good to be true, and as such seems to have more in common with a giant Ponzi scheme than responsible and prudent policy." Like the promoters of any Ponzi scheme, the government tells taxpayers, trust us, you don't need to know the detail of the scheme or have a look at the books. Just agree to put your money in because the dividends from the NBN down the track will be vast. So what has the government got to hide exactly? Well, unless the government allows the Productivity Commission to conduct an inquiry into the NBN, Parliament could reasonably assume that the government believes its own project is not commercially viable. Minister Conroy quotes cost as a reason not to hold a Productivity Commission investigation for a project costing $43 billion, the largest project in Australia's history, and we can't afford to do a study. Also, he uses time as an excuse. Well, I guarantee, Deputy Speaker, a Productivity Commission inquiry will not delay the project by 1 minute. All of the evidence suggests that the rollout will be unviable, and that is why the government does not want to conduct a productivity study. Today, we learned the Tasmanian broadband company Exetel have only signed 18 customers to their new NBN special offer of free connection and zero sign-up costs. And you'd have to ask, well, how many people have actually signed up for the 100 megabit service with Exetel? I've got to tell you, Deputy Speaker, it's not exactly selling like hotcakes because they've secured a grand total of 3 customers. 3 customers, Deputy Speaker. The CEO of Exetel, John Linton, could not explain to the media why the NBN is proving so unpopular in Tasmania. NBN Co have spent millions of dollars advertising the service available, and we should expect that small towns chosen would jump at the chance to be the first people to have the opportunity to sign up to this new service. But when it comes to Exetel, we've got 18 customers signed up in the space of 5 months. That's less than 4 customers a month. And I'd have to say, Deputy Speaker, that if I was a company executive, I'd be a bit concerned about the results of this test marketing exercise. I'd be very concerned indeed. I'd be a little less than encouraged, I might say. And don't you think that any prudent investor, after having a test marketing exercise that has yielded such low connection rates, would be having a very careful look at this project? And these figures are exactly why the Tasmanian government is going to force the public to receive connection unless they expressly choose to opt out. So you can't actually get customers in the market, so you force them to join in. Tasmanian government modelling said only between 16 to 25% of premises passed by the rollout would take up the connection on a voluntary basis, according to their estimates. So the government will start making connection mandatory unless customers opt out. If the opt-out model is implemented in mainland states and territories, the project could blow out costs by at least $3 billion, according to the McKinsey implementation study. Yet the minister said that these facts are wrong, despite the implementation study saying that if they are not installed on a demand-driven basis, instead are installed on an opt-out basis, the cost would blow out by $3 billion. This is because the government will be connecting additional homes who do not require the service. The implementation study has also recommended that the government offer incentives to retail service providers in order to sign up customers. According to the study, the incentives could run to $3 billion or $300 per customer that the telcos sign up. The government is so worried about the project and its viability that it wants taxpayers to force, or that people be forced onto the network at taxpayers' expense. And Labor is also destroying any potential competition to the NBN by preventing broadband services being provided down the HFC cable networks owned by Telstra and Optus. The government is ensuring that broadband wholesale prices will be free from competitive pressures. As Michael Porter from the Committee for Economic Development referred to in his piece in the Australian Financial Review, he said, "This means a new state monopoly surrounded by victims of political euthanasia such as cable broadband." Mr Porter goes on to say there is no physical or economic reason for denying long-term use of HFC cable for broadband purposes. Last night, the Prime Minister told the Australian Industry Group dinner that the government was committed to competitive markets. Yet the government refuses to consider a competitive approach with regard to allowing the HFC network to compete with its national broadband network. This is a cross-city tunnel approach to infrastructure, Deputy Speaker. Just as the New South Wales government closed the roads to eliminate competition from its cross-city tunnel, to force the drivers onto the cross-city tunnel, a financial disaster, I might say, the Gillard government proposes to close the HFC roads to people who might want to use the HFC network as an alternative to the NBN. Why shouldn't we have competition between carriers? Won't it result in a better outcome for consumers? Won't it result in cheaper prices? Won't it result in an excellent use of resources? Today, the Business Council of Australia called for a rigorous cost-benefit analysis of the NBN and, subject to its outcomes, and I quote, "alternative options for meeting the objectives of the government may need to be considered." These comments were backed up by Reserve Board Governor Roger Corbett, who said, and I quote, "laying cables in and between major cities is one thing, but the cost of laying cable to secondary areas is enormous. Is it justifiable? So I'm all for an independent assessment, and I ask, is laying cable the most effective way of delivering these services in these areas, or is there a better way?" The government doesn't want that question considered. If there are better ways for improving broadband services to regional areas, then surely the government should examine them before it goes ahead with spending $43 billion worth of taxpayers' money and potentially producing a massive capital loss for taxpayers. Mr Porter from Cedar also said today we need soundly financed broadband evolution, not centralised revolution. We need to fix black holes, improve satellites, expand backhaul competition to mobile towers and towns, and so on and so forth. The Coalition agrees with these assessments, which is why we believe the NBN must be analysed by the Productivity Commission. The Commission is well placed to deliver an assessment on the economic, social costs and benefits which would be delivered under this program. Every regional member of parliament should be supportive of the coalition's bill that would require the Productivity Commission to complete an independent analysis. Equally important to identifying black spots in regional area is the bill's provision that the Commission release, and I quote, an analysis of the availability of broadband services across Australia, identifying those suburbs and regions where current service is of a lesser standard or a higher price than the best services available in capital cities. Deputy Speaker, this is very much an argument about transparency. This is very much an argument about ensuring that Australian taxpayers' dollars are invested for maximum benefit to the community. It is very much an argument about appropriate technologies for differing circumstances. Deputy Speaker, there is great concern that the government is hiding behind a veil of secrecy. We see Minister Conroy ducking and weaving at Senate estimates, unable to give clear and concise answers to reasonable questions, the sorts of questions the Australian public has a right to have answers to. Deputy Speaker, it's absolutely essential we have a Productivity Commission inquiry into this investment. It's absolutely essential that we ensure that taxpayers' interests are protected while we deliver appropriate technology.
Order. Call the member for Braddon.
Just to remind the member for Cowper what this is really all about is obstructionism. What this is really all about is negativism. And what this really is all about is hypocrisy. Because if you were so enamoured with the Productivity Commission, you might have had a cost-benefit analysis done of the Adelaide to Darwin Railway. You didn't. You didn't. You might have had a productivity cost-benefit analysis to the privatisation of Telstra when you flogged it off, but you didn't. And we know about the results of that too. And if you were so keen on it, member for Wentworth, you might have had a cost-benefit analysis done of your $10 billion water plan. What happened to that? And of course, if you did have such interest in a cost-benefit analysis by the Productivity Commission, you might have had one done on the Opal Regional Broadband Plan. So don't come in here and pretend that you're interested in advancing broadband and telecommunications in Australia. That is just nonsense. You're about destroying the NBN, member for Wentworth, because that's your mandate given to you by the leader of your party who doesn't understand techo stuff, as he so rightly said. So we know what you're all about, so don't pretend otherwise. Don't pretend otherwise. So what are we really talking about with the NBN? And I think it's really important that we remember this. Connecting 93% of premises in Australia with optical fibre, delivering speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second, that's 1,000 times faster than many people experience today, and the 7% of remaining premises will receive next-generation wireless and satellite technology, providing speeds of 12 megabits per second or more. So that's what we're talking about. Now, why do we need it? Well, it's been succinctly described by Rupert Murdoch. The reason we need it is because internet delivery in Australia and the broadband is a disgrace. And I find it quite ironic, of course, that one of his stable, of course, is in the commentariat business of promoting opposition to the NBN, namely through the Australian newspaper. So I find it pretty interesting. But no doubt he still regards it as a disgrace. So why, when we look comparatively internationally, why do we need it? Well, you mightn't like to hear this. 17 out of 31 developed countries on broadband penetration. So we're 17th out of 31. We're the 5th most expensive amongst 30 developed countries in broadband prices. We're 50th in terms of broadband speeds. We'll equal last on deployment of optic fibre broadband, and we're 29th out of 50 countries on average connection speed at 2.6 megabits per second. And no Australian city is in the top 100 cities for average internet connection speed. And Australia is last in the OECD for fibre penetration for broadband. So they're the facts, that's what exists, and that's why we need the National Broadband Network. And while we're doing this, while we're doing this, as part and parcel of some of the economic benefits that we will receive through the National Broadband Network, estimates of 25,000 jobs every year on average over the life of the 8-year project, peaking at 37,000 jobs. And even the Australian Local Government Association, in its 2007-2008 State of the Regions report, stated that $3.2 billion and 33,000 jobs were lost to the Australian businesses in 12 months due to the inadequate broadband infrastructure. So that's the assessment of others of the potential for this for the future of our nation. So what have those opposite provided? Well, we've been reminded we're up to the 19th plan put forward on broadband. And it's part of the old technologies, and it's been rejected time and time again. And I found it very interesting to look at some of the commentary on the opposition's broadband plan for the last election. Indeed, it was that good, they dumped their opposition spokesperson, floating around up in the back blocks up there somewhere, rewarded for his contribution, something he never believed in because he was unable to explain it, and nor was their Treasury spokesperson or finance spokesperson, and nor was the leader able to explain it. And I think that's got very serious consequences for the credibility of those opposite in terms of their policies. So they don't have policy, and they're prepared to knock policy that belongs here. Some of the industry executives describing it as harking back to an earlier era. It lacked vision and it was muddy and unclear. And I noticed that the iPrimus CEO, Ravi Bhatia, replied in response to those opposites' policy, "What policy?" So that's what they were left with, and yet they want to come in here and lecture us, right, about providing infrastructure for the nation and in the future. The NBN plan itself has on the record and publicly support from prominent ISPs in Australia, including iNet, Internode, iPrimus, Macquarie Telecom, Adam Internet and Dodo. So they're just some of the ISPs. You'll get your turn later, mate, just settle. Also, I noticed the Australian Internet Industry Association issued a statement supporting the NBN, outlining the problems of the proposed alternatives that the other mob, those opposite, have thrown up based on wireless networks, and criticising the comparative speed of broadband in Australia. And I quote, "It's not nice to have, it's an essential part of the modern economy." Indeed, going on to say, in the past decade, Australia's internet use has grown by a staggering 12,000%, with the rate quickly accelerating. Yet despite this, as the association has pointed out, Australia was ranked 50th in the world in terms of our average broadband speeds. And on the 21st of September, Telstra has announced that they were signing on to be a provider of services under the NBN, launching a trial in, guess where? In Tasmania, to test the compatibility of its broadband service and digital products with NBN. Now, I noticed those that were charged with a drawn result in the election. I noticed those that were charged with making a decision to support one of the major parties to form government, supported essentially the Gillard Labor government based on the NBN. And I noticed Tony Windsor, the member for New England, said, and I think it's very much accurate, you do it once, you do it right, and you do it with fibre. And even my good friend, the member for Kennedy, is similarly reported as agreeing that the National Grid and NBN are a good thing for this country, a great thing for this country. Others have given their support. I noticed that Google and Intel have spoken out in strong support of the NBN. And indeed, Intel's Managing Director, Phil Cronin, said, and I quote, The government and industry should stop debating the need for the NBN. It's now time to move beyond debate. The NBN has the potential to deliver significant long-term benefits to consumers and small businesses alike. Microsoft have also added their support to the NBN project, saying, and I quote, "This infrastructure will be critical in the years ahead and essential for reducing costs in health, education and service delivery. It will also contribute to overcoming the tyranny of distance that exists in rural and regional Australia." I also note, in the little time available to me, Alan Noble's point from Google Engineering in relation to the NBN. The National Broadband Network, I quote, "will be the digital equivalent of the Trans-Australian Railway, linking small towns and large, bringing new life and new opportunities to our economy and our communities. So too," he says, "will a super-fast broadband network bring a freight train of innovation to our shores." So rather than playing games, rather than being hypocritical, rather than being negative, rather than carrying out a mandate to destroy the NBN, I suggest to the member for Wentworth and those opposite that they join the fight of future and support the NBN.
Time has expired. I call the member for Bradfield.
Mr Speaker, according to the member for Braddon, on this side we are being obstructionist and negativist to ask questions about the detail of the National Broadband Network as planned. The question, Mr Deputy Speaker, is how bad does an idea have to be before it is okay to ask some sensible questions about it? Let's be clear, we are not against broadband, very far from it. What we are against is an ill-thought-through, ill-conceived, extravagant, badly planned venture which does not have the substance and detail behind it. And if that plan is before the Australian people, we say, before it is executed, Mr Deputy Speaker, there ought to be a rigorous cost-benefit study conducted. I want to make 3 points, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the brief time available. First of all, that the history of Labor's broadband policy making has been acutely political rather than focused on good policy. Secondly, that Labor has made a very poor case for the plan they have put before the Australian people. And thirdly, we need, therefore, a cost-benefit study to make a sensible assessment of whether the nation ought to spend $43 billion on this plan. Firstly, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor's policy making has been acutely political since it announced in March 2007 a plan to spend $4.7 billion of public money to build a 12 megabit per second fibre-to-the-node network to serve 98% of the population. That was a plan that was cobbled together based upon details of a proposal to Prime Minister Howard made in 2005, subsequently released to the Stock Exchange, which in a footnote said, as an offer from Telstra to the government, that it would be prepared to build a 12 megabit per second network nationally in exchange for a subsidy of $4.7 billion, together with complete relief from the access requirements, so the network would become an effective monopoly. The Howard government rejected that proposal, unacceptable on competition terms, but Labor was keen to jump on it in early 2007, desperate for a policy. They didn't worry about the fact that the details of the Telstra proposal involved a mix of technologies, cable, copper, satellite, wireless. Oh no, apparently it was now all going to be fibre to the node nationally for $4.7 billion. They got into government. The first thing they did was junked the well-developed, well-planned Broadband Connect policy, which would by now be serving hundreds of thousands of people in rural Australia with broadband, were it not for the fact that Senator Conroy cancelled it after repeating time after time during the 2007 campaign that he would honour the Opel contract. One of the many shabby moments in Labor's disgraceful political exercise when it comes to the politics of broadband. But then, of course, the best moment, Mr Deputy Speaker, we get to April 2009 when Labor realised it had a huge problem because it could not execute on the policy it promised to the people in November 2007. And what, therefore, did they do? they decided in a purely political gesture to say, let's double our bets. Let's double our bets and we'll now go forward with a fibre to the home proposal and we'll dazzle them with talk of $43 billion. No detail behind it. Senator Conroy himself has admitted that the plan was approved in a 2-hour flight between Melbourne and Brisbane in a discussion between him and Mr Rudd, the then Prime Minister. You might remember him. All of the details substantiating that plan could be written on the back of a beer coaster. What a disgrace, Mr Deputy Speaker. Right. The essence of this plan, which is before the Australian people, is pure politics and no substance. My second point, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor has made an appallingly poor case for this plan. Why are they proposing to trash a perfectly good copper network rather than use it as the basis for building something new? Why will the National Broadband Network overbuild the HFC networks, which serve nearly 1/3 of Australian households, which can readily deliver 100 megabits per second and in Melbourne already do? Why are they proposing something which would be illegal under the Trade Practices Act as it stands today, and the only basis upon which their plan can be agreed, a plan which involves one company in an industry, Telstra, agreeing to exit so that the other company coming into the industry, NBN, has the field free and clear for it to establish a monopoly? That would be illegal under the Trade Practices Act, and the only way it can happen is because of the grubby amendment that Stephen Conroy has put before the House in this bill that we are considering this week. Mr Deputy Speaker, where are the productivity benefits that are promised? We hear about telemedicine. We never hear an explanation of why that requires fibre connected to 10 million homes. There are 1,300 hospitals in Australia, Mr Deputy Speaker. By all means, have fibre to 1,300 hospitals so we can do the direct scanning from the bush hospital into the city. But you are never going to have people having a CAT scanner in their kitchen, Mr Deputy Speaker. It makes no sense at all to fibre up every home on the basis of telemedicine. And where is the evidence, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we are going to get millions of people taking this service when we know that fixed-line broadband take-up has stalled in the last couple of years and most of the take-up now, most of the growth now is in wireless? And yet, unless we get the take-up that is unrealistically expected by Labor, this plan is going to be a financial disaster. And why has broadband policy been outsourced to Mike Quigley and the management team of NBN Co, which seems to now be making decisions that, yes, it will own the wireless network, it will own the satellites, operate them, even though the McKinsey $25 million study expressly recommended against that? Which brings me to my third point, Mr Deputy Speaker. Why do we need a cost-benefit study? Because we know the work has not been done. We heard again some verbal gymnastics from the minister earlier on, attempting to insinuate that there had been a cost-benefit study. Let me again, for the record, quote from pages Little Roman 1 and Little Roman 2 of the implementation study. Explicitly, it, meaning this study, does not undertake a cost-benefit analysis of the macroeconomic and social benefits that would result from the implementation of a superfast broadband network. So, Minister, let's not come into the House with that misleading claim anymore. There has been no cost-benefit study, and we critically need one. We need to make an assessment of whether this is a sensible use of public money. Because if you want to make the case that this venture is going to generate an attractive return, then you need to have a business case. The one that has been produced so far in the implementation study is weak in the extreme, is based upon unrealistic assumptions, and in any event, Mr Quigley, as the Chief Executive of NBN Co, keeps walking away from it, saying, well, that's not my business case, that is the implementation study. But the second question, Mr Deputy Speaker, is if we are to believe the claim that there are benefits to the nation which exceed the costs of building this network, if we are to believe the claim that there will be benefits in terms of productivity, there will be benefits in terms of medicine, there will be benefits in terms of education, then let us see the evidence. Let us see the systematic and careful quantification of those benefits. How many hospitals? How many scans? How many students will be educated? What will be the cost savings? Let us see those details, Mr Deputy Speaker, and let us, in considering this bill, which calls for the highly respected Productivity Commission to conduct just such an inquiry, let us ask the question, why is it that Labor has been running so fast from agreeing to a perfectly sensible proposal? What have they got to hide, Mr Deputy Speaker? Is it just possibly the fear, the deep-seated fear, that something that was dreamt up on a 2-hour flight from Melbourne to Brisbane, all of the details could be written on the back of a beer coaster, would not stand up to detailed scrutiny, and in fact spending $43 billion on a broadband network to overbuild a large amount of existing broadband infrastructure is not the best use of scarce public funds as compared to all of the other many good claims on the public purse. Schools, roads, hospitals, all of the other things that governments are called upon to do. And would it not be more sensible to leave it to the private sector to build most of this network, as they have over many years, and focus government intervention on the areas where the private sector will not build? Mr Deputy Speaker, the Australian people have a right to a detailed and sensible analysis of the costs and benefits of this network, and that is what we are calling for in this bill.
Call the member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, I'm so happy to be following the member for Bradfield in this debate, Mr Speaker. And the member for Bradfield would know a lot about broadband. He would know a lot about broadband compared to some of the regional members of this House, because on the electoral divisions ranked by populations of household with a broadband internet connection, one being the best, one being the worst, and 150 being the best, guess what? He's the best! He's the best, Mr Speaker. He's the best. He's the best. 64.2% of his electorate has a broadband internet connection, compared to, let's have a look at one of our other speakers, the member for Cowper. The 20th worst, Mr Speaker. The 20th worst. And yet they come in here in this place and say they're not opposed to broadband. If you're not opposed to broadband, support it. Support it and let us get on with the job. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I was also really interested in the member for Bradfield's comments that we've made a poor case for the NBN. Well, I'll let the electorate be the judge of that, Mr Deputy Speaker, and guess what? They were the judge of that. We went to the election saying, if you vote for us, you get the NBN. If you vote for them, you don't. And guess what? They voted for us, Mr Deputy Speaker. So I'm very happy, and I'm very happy that my constituents in Greenway were able to have that choice, with Riverstone being the site of the first Sydney Metro rollout. They voted for it, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I don't need to be lectured by anyone about what case has been made when the people have decided. And when we talk about, we heard here, Mr Deputy Speaker, about Labor's NBN plan being cobbled together. You want me to show you cobbled together? Hello, Mr Deputy Speaker. This was just a complete embarrassment. Of all the laughs I needed during the campaign, this gave me the most. This was a special. This was an absolute special. An absolute special, Mr Deputy Speaker. And not only, or I prefer to call it the dial-up policy, actually. It's a very good dial-up policy. I would be absolutely embarrassed to have gone to the election with this.
They got rid of him.
The coalition will... They did indeed get rid of him, Mr Deputy Speaker. The coalition will cancel Labor's reckless and expensive national broadband network. There it is in black and white. And guess what, Mr Deputy Speaker? Not only was that taken to the election, you go to the Liberal Party website today, it's still their policy. It's still their policy. Right under the little bit that says, we're about less talk, more action. I don't think so. I don't think so, Mr Deputy Speaker. When you say there's no argument against having broadband, well, here you are wanting to cancel the national broadband network. You say you want a cost-benefit analysis. They say they want a cost-benefit analysis to decide whether or not to support it. You've already decided you won't support it. So if anyone needed an example of why this was not about transparency and simply about fulfilling this bubble and squeak dial-up policy, Mr Speaker, there it is. Mr Deputy Speaker, I was also really interested in hearing the comments about why do we need 100 megabits per second. Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I couldn't think 30 years ago why I'd need the internet. I don't think Alexander Graham Bell wanted an iPhone. What we are talking about, Mr Deputy Speaker, are services and applications that haven't even been invented yet. It's not about the download. As I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not about the download, it's about the upload. It's all about the upload. This is where we are taking the country, Mr Deputy Speaker, into the future. And not only our country into the future, we're taking us to be at least comparable with the rest of the world. Now, I point out the Broadband Commission for Digital Development taken to the UN. Let's have a look. 100 megabits per second compared to dial-up, compared to the dial-up policy of the opposition. To download a simple web page at 56 kilobits per second, 23 seconds. At 100 meg, 0.01 seconds. To download a movie under 56 kilobits, a week. Under 100 megabits per second, 5 minutes. And don't think that we're alone here. Let's have a look at the other countries. Australia, Denmark, Finland, Korea, New Zealand, Portugal, Singapore, 1 gig. And we're arguing about 100 megabits per second. Mr Deputy Speaker, it comes as no surprise then that really what we're seeing from the opposition is simply continuing the leader of the opposition's misunderstandings about what's needed. They went to the election, Mr Deputy Speaker, with 12. Tony Abbott, as was said on the 7:30 report when the leader of the opposition was interviewed, well, Kerry O'Brien, I take your point. If you want to drag me into a technical discussion here, I'm not going to be very successful at it. Well, too right, they're not going to be very successful at it, Mr Deputy Speaker, because what we're talking about here are services and applications that are not only going to drag Australia into the future, drag Australia at least up to be comparable with the rest of the world, but we are going to have services and applications that are actually going to transform people's lives. And I find it incredible and incredulous, Mr Deputy Speaker, for people opposite, particularly regional members, particularly regional members who come in here and say they support broadband, but they don't support the National Broadband Network. They have some of the worst penetration rates in the country, and yet they have people such as women needing to travel thousands of kilometres for things like breast cancer treatments. When e-health, Mr Deputy Speaker, we've already seen the promises, not only the promises, but the actual realities of what e-health can deliver, the treatment of chronic disease in people's homes in real time. These things can only be delivered on a ubiquitous fibre to the home broadband network. Now, the member for Bradfield says, I don't know why we need every house connected. Well, he is welcome to pick the woman that doesn't get treatment. He is welcome to pick the child that doesn't get the NBN to their homes. He's welcome to do that. We on this side, we're about equality of opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker. We're all about equality of opportunity, which is why this NBN is truly only capable of being delivered by Labor. Mr Deputy Speaker, everyone else, in terms, Mr Deputy Speaker, of what the NBN's capable of delivering, everyone else gets it. I talked about Riverstone being the site of the first Sydney Metro rollout. Well, I'd like to read out, I went and visited Riverstone High School with the Minister during the election campaign, and I was touched, members, by receiving an email by a Year 12 student, Michael Benz, who took it upon himself to analyse the Liberals' policy that they took to the election. And as he said, what an intelligent person we have here. The NBN is a far superior proposition. It links all Australians to a superior connection with higher speed and lower latency. In the debate yesterday, which was the debate on broadband, the opposition stated that Australians have no need for 100 megabit per second connections. But as Senator Conroy correctly stated, the opposition clearly has no imagination for what this technology will do for all Australians. What a smart guy. He's going to go very far, Mr Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker. And don't just take it from me. I'm happy to quote a variety of commentators about why this needs to go on without further delay. I'm happy even to quote Harold Mitchell. I'll quote Harold Mitchell in here. As he said in the Herald on the 1st of October, unfortunately, we now have an opposition with a ferocious commitment to make broadband a battlefield, and Malcolm Turnbull appointed to demolish Julia Gillard's broadband plans. This latest round in this sorry affair is the opposition calling for a cost-benefit study. The taxpayer has already shelled out $25 million for the implementation study. We don't need to waste any more time or money. We just need to get on with it. Mr Speaker, I couldn't agree more, and I also draw on that point. I draw the point to the attention of the House to Senate estimates last week, where under questioning about about the McKinsey report. We had departmental officials talk about the McKinsey report and talk about the analysis that's been done. And Mr Murphy here, the amount of analysis through the McKinsey report and other analyses of NBN far exceeds probably analysis on other infrastructure projects. So far from this being something that hasn't been analysed and hasn't been subjected to scrutiny, I put it to this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, that if you've had 18 goes and you couldn't get it right, and you have all the commentary and everyone else in Australia getting it, then you should get on board and support this. I'm totally in agreement with you. Let's talk more action. Let's have more action on this. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I was very interested to read in yesterday's Australian, NBN, a conspiracy, says Turnbull. Yes, it's a conspiracy. It's right up there with the imaginary man on the moon and who shot JFK. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the member for Wentworth would think this is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of universal high-speed broadbands for all Australians, not just those in Vaucluse and Mossman, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's the conspiracy of targeting pilot education programs to children in households where their parents and their parents' have never had a job. It's the conspiracy of in-home monitoring for sufferers of chronic illness. Madam Deputy Speaker, if that's a conspiracy, then I'm very happy to be signed up to it. And I'll end by saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Shadow Minister came in here and he said he's seen nothing like this anywhere else in the world, nothing like this gone on. I agree with him, because I've worked on projects like this in Cambodia, China, Singapore, Malaysia. Never has there been so much wrecking by such a weak opposition.
Yeah. The member for Tangi has the call.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Both the members for Braddon and Greenway have said that the last federal election was partly won by Labor using the national broadband network to gain the key votes of independence. Indeed, both the member for New England and the member for Lyne listed broadband high on their agenda. Now, we know now that the NBN is apparently going to be rolled from the outside in. Yet Senator Conroy has yet to be honest with the Australian people about the financial implications for the NBN of Labor's negotiations with the independents. He must do so now. The NBN will be a $43 billion government-owned telco monopoly that will fail to deliver on the capabilities it has proposed. The NBN is proposed to be more than just a high-speed broadband network. The scheme is supposed to deliver a range of new technologies such as smart grid capability and open access internet protocol TV. Despite the massive cost to taxpayers, it will fail to deliver on these key capabilities. The government is rolling in a lemon. The minister is insisting that there should be a freeway on-ramp to every home, even if the householder only wants to drive the kids to school and go to the shops. And the minister insists that households pay for this on-ramp. Yet we see the reality. Only 10% uptake in the portion of the NBN currently rolled out. This project is the largest single infrastructure investment in our nation's history, and the government refuses to do a cost-benefit analysis and has not published any business case. It also refuses to allow the NBN's works to be subject to the Public Works Committee of Parliament. Any government, Liberal or Labor, has never been allowed to invest so much money with so little scrutiny or accountability. So why should the Gillard government be allowed to do so now? The cost of the scheme is of great concern, effectively $5,000 for every home in Australia. In terms of interest alone, this will be $350 to $400 per annum per household, assuming 100% take-up, and we see from the initial rollout that the take-up is only about 10%. Worse still, this is just the cost of servicing the loan. Never mind depreciation, providing service and making a profit. In reality, the current commercial price of a fibre-to-the-home connection is less than $2,000, both internationally and indeed within Australia right now. Why the Australian taxpayer should pay more than 250% above the odds is beyond me. So why is it so much more expensive? Well, it comes down to inefficient design of the network architecture. Within the NBN, there are in effect 3 fibres for every home. One could argue, do it once, do it right, and the cost of the extra fibre is insignificant in the scheme of things. However, the cost to physically install, terminate and manage the fibre is the expensive part. It would appear there is a basic misunderstanding of access network design and the fundamental physics of transmission of data using fibre. Today, we can already transmit 10 gigabits per second on a single fibre, with 40 and 100 gigabits per second coming soon. So why do we need 3 fibres to every home, with 2 of those fibres completely redundant? Senator Conroy says there's been an ACCC analysis carried out on the NBN, and that's enough to argue the government's case. But this wasn't a cost-benefit analysis and didn't consider alternative solutions. Like the government's Climate Change Committee or Committee for Predetermined Outcomes, this analysis was simply advice on how the government could implement a policy it had already decided on. This advice was deliberately limited. The Shadow Minister for Communications and Broadband has introduced a bill in this place to ensure that the NBN faces rigorous scrutiny. The National Broadband Network Financial Transparency Bill will refer the NBN to the Productivity Commission and bring the government to account over this $43 billion black hole. The production and publication of a detailed 10-year business plan, including key financial and operational indicators, will force a true and transparent analysis of the project, expose its economic and technological deficiency, and also ask a crucial question Labor has yet to ask of the NBN. Is this the most cost-effective way of providing all Australians with fast broadband? This analysis will not delay the NBN rollout and will provide advice that makes the network more efficient and more cost-effective. Throwing away money on this network won't, as the government says, foster modern and more competitive economy. Rather, it will grow our national stimulus debt exponentially and ensure generations to come are burdened by repayments on this fibre dinosaur. This government has wasted our money in the past, and if we let them, they'll do it again. You would hope, given the massive cost to the taxpayer, that as much of the technology would be sourced inside Australia to retain as much of the $43 billion as possible. We have promised the NBN would create tens of thousands of new jobs in Australia. The Treasurer last week in question time said, and I quote, "Building the national broadband network will create something like 25,000 jobs per year." The Minister for Infrastructure and Transport said of the NBN, "It will drive job creation, the jobs of the new century, the jobs of the future." Both obviously neglected to inform themselves of the facts. A number of media outlets have highlighted Australian companies sidelined in their dealings with NBN Co. Their preference to deal with international organisations has already cost Australian jobs. The fibre optic cable proposed to be used in the network is to be sourced from Corning, meaning it will be manufactured predominantly in Mexico. Why use a technology which is designed and manufactured overseas when there are Australian manufacturers of fibre optic cable which are both better designed and cheaper? The decision to go Alcatel for the gigabit passive optical network directly cost 50 jobs at NEC, who was designing their solution here in Australia for the global market. The operational support systems, business support systems solution vendor, while still to be decided, is most likely to go to an overseas organisation to the detriment of local company clarity. This firm already has their solution installed into a number of carriers, both within Australia and they are winning bids overseas. A decision such as this could mean Clarity pack up in Australia and head off overseas. Members of the Gillard government continually rise in this place to lambaste the opposition as critics of fast broadband infrastructure and information technology. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Coalition understands in an information age, access to efficient communication services is vital to improve the provision of health, education, social inclusion and economic developments. We are proponents of a network that can be adapted and upgraded as technologies improve. One size doesn't fit all. Using fibre as the solution for all Australian households, inner city, regional and rural, doesn't provide the most economical and efficient solution to the problem. Funding a project without a business plan and cost-benefit analysis is poor business practice and irresponsible allocation of taxpayer funds. The Coalition supports fibre as the backbone of any broadband project, but fibre is not the magic elixir to solve all our communication problems. Again, the government flaunts their $43 billion fibre solution as the only solution every Australian wants. But we must accept that Australians are taking up wireless broadband at a rate that far outstrips fixed-line broadband, which is now fairly static. Consumers are sending the government clear messages, but they are being ignored at every turn. In this light, it is difficult to see a business case for the NBN. Not only is the project financially irresponsible, it creates risk around competition and efficiency in the telecommunications market. I call on my Coalition colleagues, government and crossbench members to support this private members' bill and motion in both houses to hold to account Australia's biggest ever infrastructure project. This is clearly a policy that needs to be fixed. It is far too important to be left in the hands of incompetent bureaucrats and government ministers, especially those of Rudd-Gillard government infamy.
I call the Chief Government Whip.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I begin my contribution by acknowledging the contributions of the members for Greenway and Braddon. They spoke with such passion in this debate, and that should be not surprising to any of us, because people like the member for Greenway and the member for Braddon represent people for whom this debate is of critical importance. This is the equivalent, may I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, about earlier debates about sewerage. I remember my father quite infamously declaring in this place, maybe in his maiden speech, that he'd be happy to leave this place, known as the guy that gave his people the right to pull the chain. And I think some people at the time found that pretty humorous. But it is true when he was elected, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it was still true when I was elected, that people in my electorate did not have the right to pull the chain. And I'm sure that's true also of the member for Braddon's people, and no doubt at some point, maybe earlier, was true of the people who lived in the member for Greenway's electorate. We contrast that with some of those who sit on the other side. And the member for Greenway made the point that the member for Bradfield, who was railing so hard, has, of course his people at least, have access to the best internet speeds in the country. So why would they fight? Could they be expected to understand that the people who we represent need this technology? We don't have the privilege of always having it now, unlike those he represents, and to be empowered, to keep a pace, to come properly into the 21st century, to be competitive in the 21st century. The children of those people we represent in electorates like mine, and in the electorate of the member for Greenway and the member for Braddon and many others on this side, to them this is absolutely crucial. So the first question here is, why are those who sit opposite opposing this proposal, this national broadband network proposal? Well, I think we've partly answered it, although it remains inexplicable, absolutely inexplicable, why members like the member for Cowan would come in this place and so enthusiastically argue that his people, the people who live in Coffs Harbour and surrounds, should not have access to the best broadband speeds available. He should come back in here and explain himself. Now, the rest of the question, Madam Deputy Speaker, why are they opposing this? Is it because it's not needed? Well, I think we've covered that, Madam Deputy Speaker. Of course, all Australians should have the right to access to the best technology available and to be internationally competitive. Is it because it's old technology, Madam Deputy Speaker? Well, of course it's not. Is it because the country can't afford it? $1 trillion economy? Well, of course that's nonsense, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is it because consumers don't want it? I should think not, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is it anti-competitive? Just the opposite. This is transforming what is almost a monopoly telecommunications industry to a competitive one for the first time in the history of this nation. The real sad thing about this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this. Those opposite oppose this idea because it's not theirs. They oppose this very constructive and forward-looking idea because it is not there. No other possible explanation can be found. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I spoke about electorates, and I'm very glad the member for Cunningham has joined me because she could relate to this very, very well. My electorate wants the national broadband network. There can be no mistake about that. Indeed, the debate in my electorate, and indeed in the Hunter region, is one about how quickly we will have the national broadband rolled out to us. We are in there fighting. We are in there saying the region should be done first. Those closest to the city have an advantage already. Why not bring competitiveness to the regions by looking at us first? And indeed, the Hunter chapter of Regional Development Australia applied for a grant to the Commonwealth Government to appoint a facilitator, a person to work full-time for 6 months to look at what the Hunter could do to ensure that we are rolled out earlier rather than later. And James Vidler is doing, an academic from the University of Newcastle, is doing a fantastic job building the case. He's not just talking about the benefits that will roll out to consumers, because it's true that every consumer across the country receives the same benefit. What he's talking about is the region as a region with the capacity to provide the skills necessary to roll the cables and do that other work. Selling our capacity to do this thing without putting pressure on either the local economy or indeed the national economy. So while those opposite are sitting there arguing, at least in the case of those who don't have electorates like the member for Bradfield, while they're sitting there arguing why their people should be denied 100 megabits per second, those of us over this side, example being in the Hunter and the member for Newcastle, the member for Shortland, the member for Charlton are joining with me. Indeed, next week we've got a meeting, a planning meeting between all the Hunter members, the Labor members that is. The member for Patterson, unsurprisingly, hasn't shown much interest. He still believes that Hunter residents should cop second-rate wireless technology instead. And we know for a fact that if you want 50 megabits per second or more, it must be delivered by fibre optic cable. So we are having a meeting, I think it is next week, to talk more about where we are and how we're going in terms of building our case to be earlier rather than later on the rollout of the NBN. So again, it's inexplicable why the member for Cowper and others that sit on that side would be in here arguing why they should be rejecting the NBN proposal. Now, we go back to, I know that the opposition are trying to say, well, we're not necessarily against it, we think it's all right. It's just that, you know, we haven't really had a proper cost-benefit analysis. So, and the member for Greenway very cleverly waved around their policy, 5 or 6 pages, which I found pretty extraordinary. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I like the way the member for Windsor put it on, I think on Monday morning, when he talked about projects like the Snowy River Scheme, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. If you'd done cost-benefit analysis on those projects, there's no doubt in my mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, they would not have stacked up. Every time I drive up and down the F3 freeway between Sydney and my home in the Hunter, I'm constantly reminded of the mistake which was made when the bulk of that freeway was not made 6-lane. Of course, people, when they designed and constructed that highway, wouldn't have envisaged or even dreamed that 4 lanes wouldn't be sufficient to carry traffic between Newcastle and the Hunter and beyond. Just in the same way, as the member for Greenway pointed out, Jefferson and others couldn't have dreamed what we were doing with technology today, and just like I can't even dream about what I will be doing, or indeed what my teenage children will be doing with technology in 10 and 20 and 30 years' time. Now, there's no doubt that for a while they thought about making the F3 freeway 6 lanes. I haven't checked it, but I'm sure that would be the case. There would have been a debate, and someone would have come to the conclusion, no doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, that 6 lanes was too expensive and on the cost-benefit analysis simply didn't stack up. We've got to ask ourselves the question now, Madam Deputy Speaker, what is the economic cost on a daily basis of the traffic jams and the accidents caused by the decision to go 4 lanes rather than 6? I'm not criticising those who planned or made those decisions, but it's a perfect analogy. It's an example of how wrong we can get it if we rely only on a limited time basis cost-to-benefit analysis. So I ask those on the other side to reflect on that, to think about the benefits that flow from NBN that cannot even be measured in a benefit-to-cost analysis. How do you measure, a grade 6 kid who's now performing, who would have been underperforming if it wasn't for the assistance delivered to him by the National Broadband Network? How do you measure the additional happiness, if you like, of someone in an aged care home who has now the sense of security that's just brought by telemedicine into her small unit? These things, Madam Deputy Speaker, cannot be measured. I just say to those opposite, get out of the way and let the government proceed with the most important investment.
The discussion has concluded. I call the Assistant Treasurer